Right now, there is this invisible tether,
Oh, absolutely.
and it connects like the light switch in your living room, right?
Yeah.
And the supply chain that's keeping your local grocery store stocked.
Mm-hmm.
Even the server farms that are basically powering your entire digital life.
Right. All of it.
All of it connects back to this one singular 21-mile wide strip of water.
Halfway across the globe.
Exactly. Halfway across the globe. And, if movement in that tiny little channel stops today,
Things get bad.
your lights could literally go out next week. I mean, we all kind of operate under this daily illusion, right?
Yeah, the illusion that modern global infrastructure is this highly redundant, indestructible web.
Right. But when you actually look closely at the architectural blueprints of global trade, it's terrifying.
It really is.
You find that trillions of dollars in economic stability are basically balancing on just a few incredibly precarious geographical nodes.
Which is exactly why we're here today.
Yes. Today, we are focusing on a custom deep dive built directly for you, the listener.
We've got a really fascinating piece of source material.
We do. We're examining a conceptual framework text by concept developer Ali Huckrick.
And it's titled Strait of Hormuz Risk Global Energy Corridor System.
Or GECS for short. And Huckrick's concept note, it's just this surgical examination of arguably the most critical single point of failure on the planet.
Yeah, and more importantly, he actually outlines a structural blueprint for how to disarm it.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can understand this massive system designed to fix the problem, we really have to wrap our heads around the problem itself.
Which is a tiny geographic funnel carrying an unbelievable amount of global weight.
I mean, it's just wild that the entire modern world relies so heavily on one narrow strip of water.
Well, the premise Huckerick establishes right away, it kind of immediately challenges our modern assumptions about routing, right?
Oh, totally.
Like, we live in an era where data can instantly reroute around a damaged fiber optic cable in, like, milliseconds.
Yeah, you don't even notice it.
Exactly. And that digital redundancy creates this false sense of security when we look at the physical world.
But the physical world doesn't work like the internet.
No, it doesn't. The global trade of oil and liquefied natural gas, or LNG, it relies on massive physical vessels.
These huge tankers.
Right, navigating fixed geographic realities. The Strait of Hormuz is basically the ultimate manifestation of physical limitation.
Colliding with just like unyielding global demand.
Exactly. The text isolates this waterway as a primary energy choke point.
Choke point.
Yeah, a geographic funnel where a staggering percentage of the entire planet's baseline energy supply has absolutely no alternative.
None at all.
None. It has to pass through this tightly confined space.
So when I'm trying to visualize the scale of this vulnerability, I find it helps to just, strip away all the complex maritime law and international shipping jargon.
Sure, just look at the raw logistics.
Exactly. Look at the raw logistics. It's essentially like having a massive, rushing river like the global energy demand, and suddenly forcing the entire river to pass through a single garden hose.
That is a perfect way to picture it.
Right. Like the pressure is just immense. You've got the world's most concentrated supply of crude and LNG on one side of the hose.
And the entirety of global industrial demand sucking on the other side.
Exactly. But looking at the mechanics of this choke point in Huckerick's framework, I do have a question about the nature of the risk itself.
Go ahead.
Is the inherent systemic threat the physical narrowness of the waterway itself, like the garden hose is just too small? Or is it simply the sheer overwhelming volume of what we're trying to push through it every single day?
What's fascinating here is that it's the unforgiving intersection of the two.
The intersection, okay.
Yeah, that's what makes the architecture so deeply flawed. Because think about it, a narrow channel is largely irrelevant if the volume of traffic is low.
Right, it would just be a quiet little transit corridor.
Exactly. And conversely, massive volume is easily managed in vast, open, oceanic spaces.
Because ships can just disperse, alter their routes at will.
Precisely. The vulnerability Huckerick identifies is the rigid consolidation of vital, massive volume into a space with virtually zero margin for operational error.
Zero margin. Wow.
The global market requires this immense continuous flow of energy just to maintain baseline economic function.
Just to keep the lights on and the trucks moving.
Right. So by forcing that critical mass through a constricted physical bottleneck, any friction at all.
And friction could be anything, right? Geopolitical tension, a grounded ship, bad weather.
Exactly. Geopolitical, environmental, mechanical, any of that instantly transcends a localized geographic event.
It doesn't just stay in the strait.
No, that localized friction translates directly into a global systemic shock.
Because so much vital volume is squeezed through that tiny garden hose, any pinch in the hose doesn't just cause a little puddle in the yard.
It floods the entire global house.
Yeah. And Hockerich, he traces a very specific pathology of collapse regarding that shock. It's a domino effect.
A very rapid domino effect.
Right, where the initial disruption bleeds from one sector to the next. Let's methodically break down this list of consequences he provides because it's pretty staggering.
The first domino is the immediate market reaction. Violent oil price spikes.
Violent, not just a little bump at the pump.
No. When that physical toll booth is blocked, the market doesn't slowly, rationally adjust over a few weeks.
Right.
The physical supply of oil and LNG is instantly severed from the market, but the demand side of the equation.
Like aviation, freight, power generation.
Exactly. The daily requirements remain entirely rigid. You still need the fuel right now.
And that rigidity in demand is why the initial shockwave is so severe.
Yes. Global energy markets price heavily on futures and anticipated stability.
So people panic immediately.
Absolutely. When a choke point like Hormuz is compromised, you aren't just dealing with the loss of the immediate barrels of oil on the water.
You're dealing with the terror of not knowing when the next barrel is coming.
Exactly. You are dealing with the sudden pricing in of indeterminate scarcity. Supply plummets instantly, demand holds firm, and the financial mechanisms of the market force prices to spike exponentially.
It's just a mathematically unavoidable reaction.
Precisely.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, sitting at home? Because we're talking about global markets and futures.
It sounds abstract.
It does. But let's bring it to your doorstep. It's kind of like a distant traffic jam, right?
That's a good way to look at it.
Like say there's a huge pileup on a highway 3 states over. You might not see the crash, but the truck carrying your region's fresh produce was in that jam.
And suddenly your local grocery store has no tomatoes.
Exactly. And the ones they do have cost $10 each. That initial localized price explosion in the strait is the catalyst for the broader macroeconomic impact.
Which brings us to the second domino, global inflation.
Right. Which illustrates how energy isn't just a sector of the economy. It's the foundational input cost of the entire global system.
Everything sits on top of energy.
Everything. If the baseline cost of energy spikes, the cost of extracting raw materials, manufacturing goods, moving products, it all multiplies.
It shifts from an energy crisis to an absolute crisis of purchasing power.
Across every single demographic. The inflationary pressure is insidious because it infiltrates every layer of the supply chain simultaneously.
And we often isolate inflation as this, monetary policy issue, like it's just about printing money.
Right, interest rates in the Fed.
Yeah. But Hokerich's framework highlights physical supply-side inflation.
Which you can't just fix by tweaking an interest rate.
Exactly. If agricultural equipment costs twice as much to fuel, the underlying commodity price of grain rises.
The actual grain itself costs more to grow.
Yes. If the polymer resins used in packaging, which are derived from petrochemicals, if they become scarce, the cost of simply putting a consumer good in a cardboard box increases.
That's wild. So central banks are powerless here.
Largely powerless, yes, because the root cause is a physical maritime bottleneck, not excess market liquidity.
And that physical bottleneck quickly evolves from an issue of cost to an issue of actual absence. Which brings us to the logistics sector, the third domino.
Halted transportation.
Right, halted transportation.
Yeah.
Because modern supply chains, they are incredibly reliant on just-in-time manufacturing models.
Nobody keeps huge warehouses of extra parts anymore.
No, they don't warehouse months of surplus inventory. They depend on this seamless, continuously moving conveyor belt of global freight.
And when we consider the sheer volume of fuel trapped behind the strait in this scenario,
It isn't just that transportation becomes expensive, it physically cannot operate.
the physical scarcity fundamentally breaks the just-in-time model.
It just snaps.
Yeah. Freight networks, maritime shipping lanes, aviation logistics, they operate on incredibly tight fuel margins and scheduling tolerances.
So if the fuel isn't there, the planes don't fly.
The conveyor belt stops abruptly. Goods just sit in deep water ports. Wow.
Raw materials never reach the fabrication facilities. The bullwhip effect in logistics, where a tiny delay causes massive shortages downstream, it's magnified to an unprecedented scale.
We're essentially looking at the paralysis of the circulatory system of global trade.
Well put. And the pathology deepens even further, which is the fourth domino when we look at municipal infrastructure.
Right. Hochreich specifically includes electricity production failures in this chain of consequences.
Yes, and he makes a specific point to include LNG, liquefied natural gas, alongside oil in his
This
text.
is key, right? Because in the context of modern power grids, natural gas is the critical stabilizer.
It really is. It provides the baseload power and feeds the peaker plants that manage fluctuations in electrical demand.
So a disruption in LNG routing through Hormuz.
Translates directly into grid instability globally.
Wait, really? Like power grids failing across the world because one strait is blocked? Yes. Because modern electrical grids require a precise, constant frequency to function. If natural gas supplies dry up, power plants cannot sustain the necessary baseload generation.
And when generation drops below demand,
Grid operators are forced into load shedding.
which means rolling blackouts.
Exactly. Simply to prevent the physical destruction of the grid hardware. The text forces us to recognize that a maritime delay halfway around the world can literally cause the frequency of a domestic power grid to collapse.
Taking down what? Municipal water purification,
Water, communication networks, medical infrastructure, everything offline.
which culminates in the fifth and final stage of the collapse Huckerick outlines, paralyzed industrial supply chains.
The inescapable sum of the previous failures.
Right. Because if a manufacturing sector is facing hyperinflated input costs,
Plus a completely frozen freight network.
plus an electrical grid that cannot guarantee baseload power,
Industry cannot function.
it doesn't just slow down, it halts. The factories go completely dark.
And restarting heavy industrial processes after a hard shutdown is an incredibly complex, resource-intensive endeavor. It takes ages.
So seeing how quickly those global dominoes fall, it leads to this crucial realization for me.
What's that?
The root cause isn't just the threat of a disruption in the strait. It's a fundamental flaw in the architecture of global trade.
Ah, yes. The core philosophical argument of Hochreich's text.
Right. The problem is the world's dependency on a single critical route. Here's where it gets really interesting, because we're talking about a classic single point of failure.
Which is an engineering concept, really.
Exactly. And to explain it, let's look at a poorly designed home Wi-Fi network.
Okay, I like this.
So imagine you've got this amazing state-of-the-art smart home. Everything is connected. The fridge, the TV, the security cameras, the thermostat.
It's highly advanced.
Right, highly advanced,
Yeah.
super complex. But the entire house's internet comes from one cheap little router plugged into a loose wall socket in the hallway.
A socket everyone walks past.
Yes. And if someone trips over that one plug, accidentally kicking it out of the wall, the entire smart house goes dark.
The fridge stops, the cameras die.
Exactly. It doesn't matter how advanced the TD is if the single point of failure goes down.
Mm.
So my question for you is, why did the global energy market allow itself to become so overwhelmingly dependent on a single point of failure in the first place?
This raises an important question, and it's a classic consequence of market forces prioritizing immediate efficiency over long-term resilience.
Ah, efficiency. Always chasing the cheaper option.
Exactly. Systems naturally default to the path of least resistance. For decades, routing massive centralized volumes of energy through the Strait of Hormuz was simply the most cost-effective method available.
It was the easiest, logistically straightforward path.
Right. The infrastructure scaled around that assumption because it maximized profit margins. It minimized immediate transit complexities.
Just put all the ships in one line and send them through.
Exactly. The global market chased the economic efficiency of this single, massive corridor so aggressively that it allowed an existential single point of failure to emerge.
So they just ignored the systemic risk.
Ignored it completely.
Right.
Because mitigating it would have required sacrificing short-term efficiency, and no one wanted to pay for that.
That tension between efficiency and resilience, that feels like the philosophical core of Hochreich's text.
It absolutely is.
Because the problem isn't just the Strait of Hormuz itself, it's the global dependency on a single critical route.
Right.
A system built around a single point of failure works perfectly right up until the exact moment it doesn't.
And the resultant crash is absolute.
Complete destruction. So the question then becomes one of structural redesign. Because obviously we cannot physically widen the Strait of Hormuz.
No, we can't move mountains or alter continental plates.
Right. So how does Ali Hochreich propose we engineer our way out of a geographical trap?
Well, Hochreich introduces the concept of the Global Energy Corridor System, or GECS.
Right, the namesake of the text.
Yes. And the defining characteristic of this solution is its sheer pragmatism.
How so?
Well, the text explicitly outlines that the goal of the GECS is not to eliminate the Strait of Hormuz.
Oh, it's not.
No. Attempting to completely abandon such a historically entrenched, high-capacity geographic route would be logistically impossible.
And economically catastrophic, I imagine.
Exactly. Instead, the architectural mandate of the GECS is to strategically reduce the strait's critical importance.
Reduce its importance. Okay.
The system aims to downgrade the choke point from a single point of failure to merely one of many highly utilized options.
Okay, I see. It's exactly like an investment portfolio.
Oh, how do you mean?
Well, you don't throw away a profitable stock just because it's risky, right? You just diversify your investments. But if
Ah,
that one stock crashes, you don't go completely bankrupt, you spread the risk around.
that's a perfect analogy.
But let me push back a bit here. Huckerek defines this as creating alternative routes and a distributed energy transportation system,
Yeah.
right? But building alternative routes
Right.
and distributing something as massive as global oil and LNG, I mean, that sounds like a monumental, almost impossible task, right?
It's massive.
We're talking about engineering overland pipeline networks that intentionally bypass traditional maritime choke points.
Secondary and tertiary deep water ports.
Right. In entirely different geographical regions, just to handle the loading and offloading of these mega vessels. The money alone.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the capital allocation and engineering required for that level of physical diversification are indeed staggering.
Trillions, probably.
Oh, easily. However, the text positions this distributed network as the only viable path to securing macroeconomic stability.
The only viable path.
Yes, because a distributed system physically disperses the risk. If you rely on a vast network of smaller corridors, overland routes, and diversified regional hubs.
Then a disruption in any single node is just absorbed by the redundancy of the broader network.
Exactly. The volume just shifts to alternative pathways. It introduces some friction, certainly, and it might cost a bit more in the short term.
But it prevents the catastrophic cascading failure we discussed earlier. The lights stay on.
The lights stay on. It is a fundamental paradigm shift in how we approach global infrastructure.
Right, because for decades, the strategy has been to just militarize and heavily monitor the single point of failure in an attempt to protect it.
Put warships in the strait.
Exactly. But Huckerek's global energy corridor system argues that true security doesn't come from guarding a vulnerability.
No. It comes from engineering the system so that the vulnerability no longer holds systemic power.
It's about building resilience directly into the DNA of the supply chain.
Accepting the massive upfront infrastructural costs as the necessary premium for global economic insurance.
Yeah, the transition from efficiency-centric design to resilience-centric design. That seems to be the critical takeaway from the text.
I agree completely. The era of optimizing global logistics down to the absolute lowest margin of error, entirely reliant on single geographic nodes.
It's just fundamentally incompatible with a stable future.
The GECS is a conceptual blueprint for decoupling our global survival from geographic anomalies.
Man, this is heavy stuff. So as we step back and look at the entirety of Ali Huckerek's framework, the journey we've taken on this deep dive today reveals a profound vulnerability in the modern world.
It really pulls the curtain back.
It does. We started by examining the physical reality of a geographical toll booth, right? Analyzing that uncompromising collision of physical constraints and massive global energy demands.
The garden hose.
The garden hose, exactly.
Yeah.
And then we traced the strict causal chain of disruption.
The dominoes. Immediate price spiking, systemic inflation.
The collapse of just-in-time logistics. The physical destabilization of electrical grids because of the LNG bottleneck.
And ultimately, the complete paralysis of the industrial base.
Right. We dissected the historical inertia that allowed market efficiency to override systemic resilience, which is what created this single point of failure in the first place.
And finally, we explored the GECS as a necessary, massive architectural redesign.
A shift toward a distributed multinodal network that diffuses risk and actually protects the foundational layer of the global economy.
It's a huge undertaking, but a necessary one.
And for you, the listener, the implications of this deep dive are immediate and deeply personal.
They really are.
The architecture of these massive distant energy corridors dictates the cost of your groceries, the reliability of your municipal services, and the stability of your local economy.
That invisible tether is very, very real.
It is real. Huckerek's concept note is a surgical analysis of maritime energy routing, but the core thesis, the latent danger of a single point of failure, It echoes far beyond just the energy
Yeah,
sector.
absolutely.
We have spent decades prioritizing hyper-efficiency over resilience across almost all modern infrastructure. And I want to leave you with this final thought.
Lay it on us.
If our global energy, transportation, and electricity matrices have been allowed to hang by a single geographical thread, what other critical choke points exist silently in the background of our daily lives?
That's a chilling thought.
Right. Consider the digital corridors routing the world's financial data, or the highly concentrated global food supply chains.
Or the consolidated manufacturing hubs for advanced microchips.
Yes. If the foundational bedrock of global energy is this architecturally fragile, how many other single points of failure are hiding in plain sight, just waiting for the precise moment of friction to bring the whole system down?
It's definitely something to think about.
It's a question of structural resilience that defines not just the future of energy, but the future of every single system we rely on.